Wealth Progression Framework and the Financial Lifecycle. Let's break it down on this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Hawaii Retirement Show. Today we're talking about levels of wealth, or you could say the wealth progression framework, and then the financial life cycle, right? The life cycle that we all run through financially, from start to finish. So we're going to cover those two topics. The wealth progression framework, you could also call levels of wealth. The purpose of these models, there's a lot of them out there. If you Google, how somebody progresses from, at the simplest form, poor, struggling, starting out, saving to, ultra high net worth, right? And I think the framework is useful. There's a lot of variations. If you look this up, some people break it up into 5 different levels of wealth. There's 6 levels, 7 levels. And a lot of financial professionals, influencers, they have their own version of this. I kind of compiled things to kind of break it down. I think it's useful in that it tells a story. And it's good to step back and know where you are on the trajectory. I wouldn't read too deeply into any one of these, models that are out there. A lot of it depends on, the audience that these influencers or professionals are catering to, right? I mean, with these influencers, if or professionals, if you're writing, an article, or you're putting out content on a social media, or you're creating a podcast, you got to think of who's the audience, right? And the audience for this podcast primarily is people planning for and entering into retirement, right? But if you have content out there that's for young professionals or for people in the FIRE movement, right? Financial independence, retire early, then you're going to get a lot of variations on, how this is presented, this framework, these models. And in that variability, you're going to see them using different metrics, right? Maybe they use more income stability focus, or maybe they're looking at months of freedom or net worth, or they're more goal oriented on where you're at, right? But the whole idea is that you see a lot of this out there. I think it's useful framework, but there's a lot of variability depending on who's presenting these models, right? These wealth levels, and then what the target audience is of that content, right? It's always good to keep in mind. Always when you're looking at really anything beyond financials, right? I mean, you got to think who's the target audience, who's writing this, are there any incentives, what is the motivation behind this article or this content, this podcast, this story. Okay, so let's move into the framework. And again, I'm kind of generalizing and compiling, but it just gives you an idea of what to think of. And maybe you can come up with your own framework. But right, so let's give, for instance, level 1, you would say, on the framework of different wealth levels. This is financial survival, vulnerability, clarity, right? You're struggling, you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're just starting off, you're highly sensitive to emergencies, you don't really have money saved. If your car breaks down, it's kind of a really big deal at this point, right? And you're just trying to establish some income security, right? You're trying to learn about the financial systems, what guardrails can you put in place, or buffers can you put in place to start to progress yourself down the, financial road, so to speak, right? And I think the big thing here is you're starting to track income and expenses. You're starting to stabilize your cash flows. You're trying to figure out, okay, what is essential spending, what isn't, and maybe you start to look at making some small contributions to your savings and retirement here in level 1, right? So then commonsensically, right, you progress on. Level 2, right, you get a little more stability. You're a little self-sufficient. You're kind of this, you're not so scared of what lays ahead. You kind of have an idea of where you're going, and you're kind of starting to implement slowly, managing your debt. You're starting to establish that little buffer, right? Small little buffer. So you're still scared of emergencies, but you're not terrified like you were before, right? And here's where you want to start living on less than you make. You start to reduce that high interest debt. maybe your savings habits into retirement, a little inconsistent, but you're starting to get there, right? You're starting to automate your savings. You're starting to get conscious of your spending plan. You're paying down that high interest debt. And that would be level 2, right? You're kind of creeping up on the road. So let's say level 3, okay, we kind of made it through 1, which is terrifying. 2, where you at least know where you're going and you're making these tiny steps to improve. Now we're at level 3, right? You got some security. You got some breathing room. You're not terrified of what lies ahead. Maybe you have a 3 to 6 month emergency fund saved up. You got some cash. You're not terrified if you need to replace tires on your car or your car breaks down, right? And also, this is a time when probably you have some investments in place, right? You're putting into retirement accounts. You're learning about index funds and all this kind of stuff, and you're getting that company match on your 401k. Hopefully, your lifestyle is starting to stabilize, and I'd say the only challenge here at level 3, you start to get security, you start to feel comfortable, is maybe your lifestyle creep starts to go up, and that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, you often hear like lifestyle creep or lifestyle inflation talked about in negative terms, but it's like, hey, if you're living off of ramen and peanut butter sandwiches and now you have some money and you're going out to restaurants, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You got to enjoy life too. It's just you don't want to let it go too far off the rails, right, to where it becomes a problem. And also at this part, at this point here, level 3, you got that strong emergency fund. You're starting to look at insurance, risk management, right? Because now you start to accumulate assets. Remember, insurance, you're insuring against something. The reason you have a car insurance is you're insuring against a car accident, right? The reason you have homeowners insurance, you're insuring against, property damage or loss of your home, right? So now that you start to accrue assets, that's when you're starting to look at risk management and insurance, right, to protect those assets. And you're probably getting into that automated investing, whether that's through your 401k, whatever employer-sponsored retirement plan, or your IRAs or whatever that might be. So levels 1 through 3, I would say through these levels is where you really want to be selfish in a good way. And what I mean by that is you got to take care of yourself first, right? You got to set yourself up to be self-sustaining before you can go look to help anybody else. I like the airplane analogy, right? When they give you the talk and they say, don your oxygen mask first before helping anybody else. Because if you pass out and you're not, with it, then you're not going to be able to help anybody else out, right? So you got to take care of yourself so you put yourself in a good position to help others out. So levels 1 through 3, you really want to be selfish with your money in a good way, because you're setting yourself up financially to be in a good position to help and give back later on. Okay, moving on to level 4. So now you got some growth, you got some flexibility, right? You got a significant financial cushion. You can fund your lifestyle choices, right? You're traveling, you got some hobbies, you got some optionalities in there. Maybe you can change careers. Maybe you can take time off because you got some money saved. You can start a business. Whatever it might be, you're kind of in you've kind of made it over the hard hump, right? Maybe you got multiple income streams. You start to have, maybe you bought a house and you have a renter. Maybe you, whatever it might be, right? Your portfolio is growing now. That snowball that you've been putting into painfully and seeing minimal growth is now kind of reaching a critical mass where it starts to show some returns, right? It's starting to throw some fruit because it's growing on its own. And I think the challenge here, when you reach this point, is staying disciplined. And again, the lifestyle creep's not a bad thing as long as it doesn't go off the rails, right? You got to, act how you can afford to act, right? I think the ego gets in the way and we like to impress or keep up with the Joneses, right? Everybody knows about these things, but, it can be unsustainable if it goes off the rails. Here, you're probably starting to think about tax optimization, right? And estate planning and long-term care planning and stuff like that, because you've amassed a certain amount of wealth to this point at level 4 where you can see where things are headed and you're in a good position. And now it's about optimization, right? You got the basics down. You're investing, you're diversified, everything is growing, your assets are growing, you got the right insurance in place for all your assets. And now it's about optimization, tax optimization, and estate planning, right? We talked about insurance, how once you accumulate assets, you want to insure against, various risks that could present themselves to those assets. And again, this is where estate planning comes in, especially for houses. Maybe you set up a trust, put the house in a trust, and you start thinking about your children and make sure that the assets are correctly, and the beneficiaries for that matter on different accounts. But the assets are going to go to who you want them to go to in case of an emergency, right? You get those documents all in place. Okay, so we covered 1 through 4. Level 5, financial independence and freedom, right? So this is essentially, you reached a point where all your basic needs are met. Work becomes optional. You got a large buffer. You got a strong diversified portfolio. Your retirement accounts are ahead of schedule. Your financial lifestyle is what it is, and it doesn't make an impact on where you're headed financially. Here, I would just say, the challenges are complacency, right? And then obviously when you switch to retirement, and we'll get into this with the financial life cycle, is things like sequence of return risks, or how are you going to develop a strategy to utilize your assets and position them the best way for long-term tax planning and safe withdrawal strategies and all this kind of stuff. But at this point here, you kind of won, right? Work becomes optional. And that's a great place to be in this financial independence, financial freedom. So we got 2 more, 6 and 7. 6 is just, at this point, it's abundance. You're affluent, right? You got, I don't know what that is. It all depends on where you live. Here in Hawaii would be, a significant more. But let's say, it's 5 million plus, right? You're pretty affluent. You can get involved with some philanthropy. You got passion projects. You're traveling a lot. You got multiple strong income streams probably. And then what you're looking at here is now wealth preservation, right? Once you get over 5 million, you're going to look at possibly some, estate taxes, and just getting a little more in the weeds with some of the high net worth strategies around like legacy building, different trusts. Maybe you're starting to look at, grantor retained annuity trusts and all these advanced tax strategies within those. And then level 7, I mean, that's the top 1%, extreme wealth, right? And that's just, once you get to that level, it's just, it gets very legal in wealth structures and businesses and valuations and stuff. But I'll say this, across all levels, the fundamentals of investing doesn't change. I think sometimes that's a misconception. There's more opportunities available to you when you become affluent and high net worth that aren't available, to those, just an upper middle class and that financial independence, financial freedom. But, there's a lot of people who are in this abundance affluent group who are still investing in diversified, low cost index funds. And that's the bulk of their wealth, or maybe some rental properties, right? I think definitely, obviously, with the top 1%ers, I mean, it's just a whole different game with private equity and business structuring. But the point I'm trying to drive home here is that you can use the fundamental, tried and true investment approaches that have been talked about forever, all the way through, right? I mean, you just go look at Warren Buffett and some of the advice he gives, right? I mean, and he's living a lot of that advice. Obviously, he takes big swings with his company, but I mean, if you look at some of his quotes, he even makes a case for, just going the broad-based, diversified, low-cost index fund approach, even at his stage, right? I think sometimes people get caught up in believing that the more money you make, the more tricks of the trade there are. I think tax-wise, maybe, but investment-wise, I mean, more opportunities are available to you because you have capital, but it's not like there's unlocked tricks that become available, right? It's still, investing just the same. Okay, so let's move on to those are the levels. And again, that's just kind of what I consolidated. If you go search the internet or you look on, YouTube or whatever it is, Instagram, you're going to see all different 5 levels of wealth and the 7 levels of wealth. I think it's a good framework. I think it's a good framework to kind of understand, okay, where am I in my own framework of this levels of wealth and where am I heading and what do I need to work on and where am I going, right? It tells a story, and I think stories are good. Okay, so let's talk about the financial life cycle, and I've talked about this before, but essentially what I'm referring to is there's 3 main periods of a financial life cycle to me. Okay, so there's the accumulation phase, early in life, right? You're saving, accumulation, right? You're getting a job, you're starting to build up wealth, and then there's the transition and pre-retirement planning, right? And this is where you're probably in your late 40s, maybe, early 50s or late 50s. These are your high earning years. You've built up a nest egg. And in this transition pre-retirement period, this is where you're really looking at financial planning opportunities. 1, to accelerate your savings because you're in your high earnings, right? And 2, to sort of position yourself over the next whatever it is, right, 10, 15 years to be in a place to switch over to that decumulation or retirement phase, right? Now, this framework, the financial life cycle, I think is important because if you are in the decumulation or retirement phase, you're probably going to be investing a little differently than if you're in the early in life accumulation phase, right? Because you've switched from saving to now spending, distributing from these retirement plans. Now that transition period is where you're starting to position assets. We talk about asset location, and then there's, you start to position it with a tax allocation and an asset allocation that positions yourself for your situation for the best distributions, tax efficient distributions, where you can maintain some level of growth, but also minimize volatility so you can start to look at your retirement plan as a distribution portfolio. And here we get into sequence of returns risk, which I talked about before, right? You start to position yourself so that if you retire in a market downturn, you're not going to take a huge hit on your retirement portfolio that you won't be able to recover from. A lot of ways to do that, right? A lot of different distribution strategies. I'm not a big fan of a lot of annuities out there, but there are some annuity products that help satisfy this. There's distribution strategies like guardrails, right? There's the safe withdrawal rate, 4% rule, right? There's all kinds of ways to position yourself and distribution strategies to implement to offset the sequence of return risk. But in here, I say this is the place where I would recommend most people, do-it-yourselfers, reach out to advisors, if for nothing else, a second opinion. And I'm biased in this approach, right? Because outside of this podcast, I am an advisor and I help with retirement planning. But here is where you don't know what you don't know, and it's good to get a second opinion. When you're in the accumulation part of your life, just sock away that money, whatever you can, into those retirement accounts, whether that's through your employer or through your IRA. Put it in those low-cost, diversified index funds, and just try to, maximize the growth, right? But as you start to switch, things get a little more complicated. Not to say you can't do it yourself. As long as you just put in the time and research and understand what you're trying to accomplish and how you're going to turn this sum of money that you worked hard for all those years from a savings portfolio, a growth portfolio, into a distribution portfolio. Lot to consider there. And then I talked about this before too, the decumulation of retirement phase of life. Gets broken down to 3 different segments. These aren't mine. Somebody else came up with these, but I love it. It's your go-go, slow-go, and no-go phases of retirement. So obviously, go-go, early in retirement, you hit the ground running, you're having a lot of fun, traveling. And then what you tend to see is people start to enter the slow-go. They slow down a little bit, maybe take less trips, spend a little less money, go out to eat a little less. And then, unfortunately, all of us, well, unless there's an unfortunate accident, most of us will end up in this no-go phase where towards the end of our life, we're just kind of, you're exhausted, you're tired, you'd rather just stay home and tend to the garden than go traveling around the world, right? So you can see spending gets broken down in that retirement phase. Mostly in the go-go, right? I mean, that's when you're capable and able to do a lot of things that you've been saving for. And then you got your slow go where spending slows down, and then your no-go where spending actually creeps back up again, but not because you're running around spending a lot of money, but more because of maybe it's long-term care or health issues there. I think that's a good framework to look at retirement. Now, when you're looking at a distribution portfolio, you got to think, I don't want to run out of money, right? So you're going to be a little bit conservative in how you distribute from that portfolio in case you have a very long retirement. But at the same time, looking at this framework of go-go, slow-go, and no-go, you don't want to be too conservative to where, okay, you made it through, you made your money last, but now you're unable to enjoy it because of health reasons, or you just don't have the energy, right? It's kind of it's a hard thing to balance, right? Because you want to spend the money while you can enjoy it, right? But at the same time, you want to balance the idea of not spending too much early and depleting your assets where nothing's left at the end of your life. And that is the challenge of a decumulation or distribution portfolio. Okay, so I hope this makes sense. I just want to go through it because you see so much of these different, financial wealth levels, so many 5 levels of wealth, all these different ways of putting it. And I think it's good. It tells a story, and it's pretty commonsensical. But I would say just make up a story for yourself of what this framework looks like, figure out where you are and where you want to go. And I'd say act accordingly, right? Invest and spend how you can afford to act for where you are and where you want to go. The other point I'll add to that is, I've said this before, paddle your own canoe, run your own race, right? Whatever metaphor you want to use. Everybody's different on where you fall into this. A lot of stuff, a lot of this kind of content gets thrown out there, and I think people gravitate towards it so much because they want to see, where do I stack up? Where am I? Where am I against my peers, against my friends, against my family? Where am I at? Am I winning the race? Am I losing the race? And I would say, you're only running a race against yourself, and that's all that really matters. And so plot your own race, right? That's the most important thing. It's almost good to put on blinders in this comparison culture and just run your own race. Last thing I'll leave you with is, money is a tool, not the goal, right? The goal isn't money. The goal is a good life, good experiences, and to use money as a tool. A certain amount of money provides a lot of freedom and provides the ability to do things that otherwise might not be available to you, and it definitely alleviates all your money problems. If you're stressed out over paying bills and all that, no doubt about it. But remember, anything beyond that, money is a tool. It's not the goal. Okay, I think that wraps it up. Next episode, I'm going to talk about, net investment income tax. And, maybe talk about mutual funds versus ETFs. We'll see, but if there's anything in particular you'd like me to talk about on the show going forward, email it over to aloha@hawaiiretirementshow.com, and I'll catch everyone on the next one.
The opinions and statements presented on this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations. Never make any investment or financial decisions based on information offered on this show without first consulting your financial, legal, or tax advisor. All economic and performance information mentioned on the show is historical in nature and is not indicative of any future results. All indices mentioned on this show are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. Lastly, all opinions expressed by Jason Katita and any guests on the show are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of or are endorsed by Toba Financial. For Jason Katita, investment advisory services are offered through Toba Financial LLC, a registered investment advisor offering advisory services in the state of Hawaii and in other jurisdictions where exempt from registration.